In the heart of Provence, where the lavender fields stretch endlessly like purple waves under the golden sun, there lay a sleepy village called Belleville. The houses were made of soft stone, their shutters painted in faded hues of blue and green. Flower boxes overflowed with petunias, and the narrow cobbled streets always smelled faintly of rosemary and fresh bread. An old clock tower chimed softly every hour, a sound that echoed gently through the hills and vineyards. Time, in Belleville, moved slowly. No one rushed. No one hurried. It was a place for watching clouds drift and for sipping tea while the sun filtered through linen curtains. Living in a sun-warmed cottage on the edge of the village was Monsieur Henri, a retired bookbinder with silvery hair and a gentle laugh. He spent his days walking with his dog Clement through the orchards, reading poetry, and tending to his roses. Henri believed that every day should have at least one nap, one cup of chamomile tea, and one small adventure. Today, Henry's adventure was simply this: to find the perfect honey for his evening tartine. He slipped on his straw hat, patted Clement on the head, and stepped into the golden afternoon, his cane tapping softly on the ground. In the days that followed Lucien's return to Saint Oriol, the village quietly stretched into the soft rhythm of late summer. The fields, wrapped in golden hues and lavender purple, seemed to hum with a sleepy music that belonged only to this corner of Provence. It was a tune the breeze knew well, winding through olive groves, brushing the bellflowers, and rustling the climbing roses on old stone walls. Lucien took to walking again, not merely strolling, but something deeper. It was his daily meditation, a slow ritual beneath skies the color of antique porcelain. His feet carried him along a narrow, winding trail the locals called Le Chemin de Lavande, the lavender path. This path began near the foot of his vineyard and stretched lazily toward the hills, where ancient fig trees stood guard like wise elders. Time itself seemed to walk alongside him. Birds hopped in low arcs through the air, and sometimes a cicada would trill, only to fall silent again as if embarrassed by its own excitement. On this path, Lucien found memories waiting like little offerings. Here, he remembered walking hand in hand with Claire, years ago, when her laugh echoed off the thyme bushes and her straw hat danced in the wind. Further down, he passed the broken stone bench where his grandfather once sat and told stories about the stars and the days when the vineyard had only 2 rows of vines and 1,000 dreams. One particularly gentle afternoon, with the sky quilted in white cloud lace, Lucien found a folded letter inside the wooden box he had fixed by the trail for wildflower seed exchanges. The envelope was cream-colored and sealed with a pressed violet. The handwriting was careful, perhaps even shy. To the keeper of this path, I walk here every morning at sunrise. I do not know your name, but I see your footprints and feel the kindness left in the seeds you share. Thank you for letting this trail bloom not only with flowers but with peace. If you ever find a day heavy, I hope the breeze here carries your thoughts gently. No signature. Just a small sketch of a bee with a smiley face. Lucien smiled and folded the note carefully, placing it in the pocket closest to his heart. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of worry, or thoughts racing wild, but because the quiet was so full of presence. Outside his window, the crickets played their quiet concert. The stars blinked lazily, like sleepy guardians. The scent of lavender drifted in from the hills. Something was changing, not in a dramatic way, but like the gentle settling of dew on the grass. He thought of the letter again and of the footprints he sometimes saw in the dust, small, deliberate, almost like a dance. Was it the baker's daughter, who often sang in the early morning when she thought no one was listening? Or perhaps Madame Elise, the widowed schoolteacher who once traveled the world and now spent her days sketching old fountains. Whoever it was, Lucien felt an invisible thread pull between them, two strangers, connected by silence and wildflowers. The next morning, Lucien rose before the sun. He packed a little basket with brioche, honey from his neighbor's hives, and a tiny jar of wild cherry jam. He tied a napkin around it with twine and placed it in the seed box, along with a new note. To the early morning dancer, thank you for the violet. It now lives inside a book of Rimbaud's poetry, where it fits quite well. If you ever wish to share a sunrise over tea, I make a fine brioche. No pressure. Just a friendly invitation from a quiet walker who appreciates quiet walkers. He signed it with a sketch of a teacup and 3 dots for steam. Then, he walked the path again, taking his time. Each leaf along the trail seemed to whisper secrets. The stones held warmth from yesterday's sun. A turtle, slow and unbothered, watched him from a puddle like a sage. As he walked, Lucien felt his breath soften, and with it, the ache of old sadness untied itself like a boat from a dock. He sat at the stone bench and closed his eyes. And when he opened them, the sunrise had painted the horizon in tender oranges and peach blush pinks. Light filtered through the lavender in golden shafts, and in that moment, Lucien felt more awake than he had in years. Not the alertness of worry or urgency, but the quiet, luminous wakefulness of the soul. Later that week, another note appeared. Dear teacup artist, your brioche is better than the village bakeries, and that is saying something. I accept your invitation with gratitude. Thursday morning, at the old fig tree near the bend. I'll bring time tea and a story. Lucien's heart skipped, not in the flutter of romance, but in the soft anticipation of connection. Thursday arrived on the wings of a breeze that carried the scent of lemon verbena. Lucien wore his light blue linen shirt, the one that Claire once said made his eyes look like summer skies. At the fig tree, a blanket was already laid out. A little porcelain teapot with hand-painted violets sat waiting. Next to it, a woman stood, perhaps in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. She had silver-threaded hair tied with a ribbon and eyes that smiled before her lips did. Bonjour, she said gently. Lucien nodded. Bonjour. They didn't rush. They sat. They sipped time tea. She told him her name was Colette, and she had moved to Saint Oriel 5 years ago from Lyon, after her husband passed. I needed quiet, she said, but I didn't expect to find joy waiting in the quiet. Lucien understood that deeply. He told her about the vineyard, the bench, the stars, and the bee with a smiley face. They laughed like old friends reunited, not strangers meeting. That morning turned into many mornings. Tea became a ritual. Stories were exchanged like old postcards. Silence was honored as much as conversation. Lucien began planting more lavender along the path. Colette brought small wind chimes and hung them in the fig tree. The path bloomed not just with flowers, but with the gentle presence of two lives unfolding beside one another. And in time, the village came to speak of Le Chemin de la Vendée not just as a walking trail, but as a place where hearts could remember themselves. Some say that on particularly quiet mornings, if you walk slow enough and breathe deep enough, you can still hear laughter under the fig tree and the distant chime of Colette's bells. Others believe the path listens. And Lucien? He no longer walked alone. Even when Colette was away visiting her daughter, he felt her there, in the wind, in the flowers, in the steam rising from his teacup. Saint Auriel had always been peaceful, but now it had a lavender path. And along that path, love had returned, not loud, not grand, just quiet enough to feel like home. In the heart of Saint Auriel, the village bakery was more than just a place to buy bread. Its small blue shutters opened each morning like eyelids waking slowly from a dream, and from within, the aroma of warm croissants and honeyed brioche drifted into the cobblestone streets like a sweet morning song. The bakery had been run for generations by the Lefebvre family. Now, it belonged to Juliette Lefebvre, a woman in her early 60s with eyes the color of burnt sugar and hands that moved like poetry across dough. She spoke little, laughed often, and knew the exact moment when a loaf had reached its golden perfection by scent alone. Lucien had begun stopping by again, not just for the bread, but for the quiet ritual it gave him. A walk through the morning air, a nod to the postman, a moment by the flower stall, and then the tiny silver bell above the bakery door that whispered, "You're home again." It had been Colette who reminded him how much joy he once found in such things. They still met on the lavender path often, especially on market days. Sometimes they brought books, sometimes music. Most times they brought nothing at all, only silence and the comfort of being witnessed gently. One morning, Lucien walked into the bakery earlier than usual. The village was still stretching awake. A cat blinked slowly from a windowsill. The baker's assistant had just flipped the overt sign. And there, on the wooden counter near a tray of almond twists, was a letter. It was folded neatly, with a pressed cornflower tucked inside. To whomever enjoys silence more than words, if this letter finds you, I hope you've also found peace. I write from a bench by the olive trees, where time seems to pause. Do you ever notice how birds know when you need a song, or how the wind holds its breath when you feel heavy? There is magic in this village, but it speaks very softly. I hope you're listening. There was no signature. Lucien smiled. It reminded him of Colette's first letter, though the handwriting was different. He tucked it gently into his journal, alongside dried petals and old wine labels. From that morning on, new letters began to appear in the bakery every Wednesday. They were never signed. Sometimes poetic, sometimes playful. One note asked, "Do you think baguettes dream of being violins?" Another said, I watched a butterfly land on my teacup and decided to cancel my afternoon plans. Juliet, the baker, never said who was leaving them, but she began to smile when Lucien arrived. I think they're meant for people like you, she said one day, handing him a fig tart wrapped in parchment. People like me? Lucien asked. People who notice things, who don't rush. He took that as a compliment of the highest order. That evening, he wrote his own letter and left it beside a basket of poppy seed rolls. To the artist of small thoughts, thank you for reminding us that quiet minds still sing. Your letters are like morning rain on a hot stone, unexpected, soft, and needed. If you ever wish to walk the lavender path, I will leave a stone painted with a sun by the old fig tree. You'll know it's yours. And he did. 2 days later, the stone disappeared. But in its place, someone had tied a ribbon around the fig tree's lowest branch, sky blue and fluttering in the breeze. That was the beginning of something new. Not quite friendship, not quite mystery. More like the dance of wind chimes, never quite sure which gust brings the music, only that it always arrives at the right time. Weeks passed in the slow rhythm of rural life. The vineyard thickened with grapes. The lavender was harvested, tied into bundles, and hung to dry in the shade. Children returned to school with satchels filled with crayons and baguette slices. The cafe umbrellas came down one by one as autumn tiptoed in. One golden Sunday, the village gathered for the Fête du Pain, the bread festival. Long wooden tables were set in the square, covered with linens and wildflowers. Everyone brought something: tapenade, cheeses, roasted vegetables, walnut tarts. Juliet baked 40 loaves and a giant fougasse shaped like the sun. Lucien brought bottles of last year's rose and helped the mayor string lanterns between the trees. As twilight settled in, the villagers lit candles in old jars. Musicians began to play violins and accordion waltzes. Laughter braided itself through the breeze. Lucien sat beside Colette, their shoulders just brushing. Across from them, Juliet handed out slices of pergolette. And then someone began to read. It was Madame Elise, the retired teacher, holding a notebook full of handwritten letters. I've been collecting them, she said softly. The ones from the bakery. I hope whoever wrote them doesn't mind. She cleared her throat. Today I watched an apricot fall from a tree and thought, even fruit knows when it's time to let go. A murmur of warmth passed through the crowd. Another letter. If I were a window, I'd face the sea. If I were a cloud, I'd rain only on vineyards. People smiled, nodded. Lucien looked at Colette. She was smiling too. Then Madame Elise read one more. Once I fell in love with someone's handwriting. I never met them. But I still think of the way their letters curved like kindness. There was silence after that, deep, whole, and glowing. Later that night, Lucien walked home through the quiet streets, candle wax still clinging to his fingers, the scent of baked figs in his sweater. Above him, the stars spilled across the sky like spilled salt. He felt something inside him settle, like a stone in the river finally finding the place it belonged. That evening, he lit a candle on his windowsill. The breeze caught the flame and carried its light toward the hills. And somewhere, not far from there, someone watched that light and smiled. In the soft embrace of early evening, when the sun lingered just a touch longer over the golden countryside of Provence, the Chateau de Chanterelle began to hum with a gentle energy. The shutters of the windows creaked open one by one as the scent of jasmine drifted through the warm breeze, curling into corners and caressing the linen curtains like a whispered lullaby. Julien stood barefoot on the terracotta tiles of the garden path, his toes pressing lightly into the sun-warmed surface. Before him stretched an orchard he had not walked in years. Apples, pears, and figs had grown in wild abundance during his childhood here, long before the chateau had been inherited by distant relatives. Now the trees stood quietly, their branches heavy with ripening fruit, the air thick with the perfume of blossoms and overripe sweetness. This orchard, once tended lovingly by his grandfather Henri, was where he had spent countless afternoons with a wooden sword, fighting invisible dragons beneath the fig trees or lying in the tall grass listening to cicadas sing. Julien walked beneath the trees slowly, letting his fingertips brush against leaves and fruit. The apples blushed beneath his touch as if remembering the little boy who once climbed their branches with scraped knees and wild laughter. He paused beneath a pear tree and looked upward. The sky was streaked with lavender and gold. Somewhere above, swallows cut silent arcs through the air, returning to their nest beneath the roof tiles. The weight of the past didn't press upon Julien. It hovered gently around him like a shawl placed by loving hands. As he sat on a mossy stone bench, the soft crunch of footsteps approached. Isabelle. She was wrapped in a shawl of deep blue, and her cheeks were pink from the evening chill. She carried a small wooden basket and a bottle of lavender wine. "Would you like to help me gather some fruit?" she asked, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves and soft laughter. Julien smiled. "Of course, as long as we drink the wine afterward." They worked in companionable silence, occasionally offering each other a pear or apple and laughing at the most misshapen ones. The orchard, in its peaceful wildness, seemed to lean in to listen. When the basket was nearly full, they returned to the bench and poured 2 glasses of wine. The scent of lavender floated up with the steam of the first sip. It was warm and slightly sweet, with a calming floral taste that settled into their bodies like a lullaby. "I remember you used to chase me around this orchard," Isabelle said, watching the light fade between the leaves. "You always ran faster," Julien replied. "No, you just let me win," she countered, smiling. Silence settled over them like a soft blanket. Crickets began to chirp, their rhythm slow and steady. The moon appeared, round and pale, like a watchful eye above the trees. "I think this place remembers us," Julien murmured, resting his head back against the trunk of the pear tree. "I think it does," Isabelle whispered, closing her eyes. And for a while, they didn't speak. The orchard held their memories tenderly, as it had for generations before them. The stars winked one by one into view, and the wind hummed its ancient lullaby through the branches. There was no rush, no tomorrow, no world beyond the soft rhythm of breath, the taste of lavender wine, and the echo of laughter long past. Just peace. The morning sun peeked shyly over the horizon, casting honeyed light across the vineyards surrounding the Château de Chanterelle. Birds chirped softly as though not wishing to disturb the dreamlike serenity of the new day. Inside the chateau, the windows glowed with a warm, golden hue, and the soft scent of baking bread floated from the kitchen like a silent invitation to wake slowly, gently. Julian stirred beneath a linen sheet, the sleep still clinging to his limbs. He had slept more peacefully than he had in years. His dreams had been full of warm orchards, fig trees, and laughter, memories made tender by time. As he blinked into the dappled morning light, he felt the stillness of the chateau holding him like a lullaby that had not quite ended. Downstairs, Isabel was already awake, seated in the small sunroom where her grandmother used to embroider. The light filtered through lace curtains, casting floral shadows across the parquet floor. In her lap rested an old leather-bound journal, and beside it, a small bundle of letters tied with a pale lavender ribbon. Julian padded into the room in his slippers, drawn by the scent of jasmine tea and old paper. He saw Isabel looking down at one of the letters, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Morning," he said, his voice low and husky with sleep. She looked up and gestured to the chair across from her. "Morning. I found something last night in the writing desk. Letters from your grandfather Henri, written to a woman named Elise." Julian raised an eyebrow. "My grandmother?" Isabel shook her head. "No. I thought so too at first. But this Elise wasn't your grandmother. She was, well, I think she was someone he loved before." Julian sat down slowly, curiosity growing like ivy. "What do they say?" Isabel unfolded one letter delicately, the ink a soft lavender hue that had faded over time but still carried elegance in its loops and flourishes. "My dearest Elise, the fig trees have bloomed again, and every blossom reminds me of you. I walk the orchard alone now, but I see you in every petal, every gust of wind, every evening bird call. The world is quieter without your laughter, but in the silence, I remember you more clearly than ever. I keep your scarf on the bench beneath the pear tree. It still smells faintly of lavender. Yours always, Henri." Julian sat back, struck by the gentleness of the words. There was something timeless in the letter, as if it were written not just to a person, but to a moment, a feeling too fragile to name. "She must have meant a great deal to him," he murmured. Isabel nodded, her fingers tracing the delicate paper. "There are dozens of them. Some are full of joy, others just quiet reflection. He never sent them. They were all kept here." They spent the rest of the morning reading through the letters, occasionally pausing to sip tea or look out the window at the gardens. The chateau seemed to sigh softly around them, grateful that its hidden stories were finally being heard. At noon, they walked to the orchard, bringing one of Henry's letters with them. The fig trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the bench beneath the pear tree waited like a silent witness. Julian read the letter aloud, his voice steady, reverent. As he finished, the wind stirred the branches, and a single fig dropped softly to the ground at his feet. Isabel smiled. "It's like he's still here." Julian looked at her, the sunlight dancing in her eyes. Maybe he never left. They sat in quiet contemplation, the orchard once again becoming a sanctuary of memory. And for a moment, time folded in on itself, allowing the past and present to coexist in the hush of rustling leaves and soft footsteps on moss. Evening would come again, as it always did, and with it, perhaps, another story whispered from between the walls of the chateau. But for now, there was just the orchard, the letters, and the warmth of remembering. A light rain began to fall that evening, not a storm, not a downpour, but a gentle sprinkle, as if the sky were breathing softly upon the earth. The kind of rain that invited one to light candles, sip something warm, and speak in whispers, if at all. Inside the Chateau de Chanterelle, the soft pattering on the windows created a rhythm so delicate, it felt like nature's lullaby. Julian sat by the window in the small library, a room lined with faded books and the quiet dust of generations. A fire crackled gently in the stone hearth, and the scent of rosewood mingled with the old paper and rain. He held another one of Henry's letters. This one was dated mid-autumn, decades ago. The ink had faded further, and a small dried violet had been pressed between its folds. Dearest Elise, I watched the rain fall upon the roses this morning. It was the kind of rain you used to say made the world softer. I remembered the day we danced barefoot in the garden, our hems soaked, our laughter startling the birds from the trees. Time moves forward, but I remain where you left me, quietly tending the soil, singing to the time, listening for your steps in the hallway. Yours, Henri. Julian closed the letter and looked out the window, his heart unusually full. The rain was still falling, kissing the petals of the very same rose bushes Henri had once described. For the first time in years, Julian felt not alone but part of something gently eternal, a stream of memories flowing like water through time. Downstairs, Isabel had lit candles in the dining room, their glow reflected in the wine glasses, creating flickers of golden light on the ceiling. She had found an old Provençal stew recipe in one of the kitchen drawers and now stirred the pot gently, humming a lullaby she barely remembered learning as a child. Julian joined her quietly, slipping an apron over his shirt. He helped chop herbs, rosemary, thyme, bay leaf, and for a long while they didn't speak, the soft rain filling the silence with something warm and sacred. When they sat to eat, they shared stories, not dramatic ones, but slow, sweet recollections, a childhood kite that flew too high, the smell of a parent's coat, the warmth of sun on bare shoulders during summers past. Later, as the rain continued to hush the world outside, Isabel brought out a small music box she had found in the attic. She wound it carefully, and a delicate melody filled the room, a waltz so soft it seemed spun from mist. They sat on the floor by the fire, wrapped in wool blankets, the world outside a blur of gray and green. And there, between the hush of raindrops and the soft tick of the music box, something unspoken settled between them. Not romance, not quite yet, but the early trust that such a thing might come slowly, like spring thawing winter. Julian reached for one more letter before bed. This one had no date. Just 3 lines in the same lavender ink. Even when it rains, you are the sunlight in my orchard. Even in silence, your name is the prayer in my breath. If ever you return, I will be waiting by the pear tree. Underscore. That night, they each returned to their rooms and fell into the deepest sleep either had known in years. The kind of sleep that feels like a return, not to a place, but to oneself. Outside, the rain kept falling. The roses kept listening. And the chateau, old and quiet, dreamed along with them. Morning broke with a silver light, one that filtered softly through the chateau's gauzy curtains and gave everything the glow of early spring, though it was still late autumn. The rain had stopped during the night, and in its place came a rare and hushed stillness, as if the entire landscape had paused to admire its own reflection. Julian awoke earlier than usual. The letter from last night echoed through his dreams, especially the line, "I will be waiting by the pear tree." Something about it tugged at him with quiet urgency. He dressed in wool and linen, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped outside. The ground was soft with moisture, and the roses in the garden were heavy with droplets. As he made his way around the side of the chateau, he passed the herb beds and the little footbridge, and followed the stone path Henri had once laid down by hand. There, near the edge of the orchard, stood the pear tree. It was tall and weathered, its bark furrowed and its branches sparse in the cooler air. But it stood with quiet dignity, the kind of tree that felt more like an old friend than Flora. Beneath its base, the moss had grown thick and soft, and to Julian's surprise, the earth seemed to bulge ever so slightly, as if holding a hidden memory just beneath its skin. He crouched, gently brushing aside the moss. A small patch of bricks revealed themselves, laid deliberately, forming a square just wide enough to suggest a hidden hatch. With careful hands he pried one loose. Beneath it, in a cavity just big enough for a box, lay a small wooden chest wrapped in oilcloth and tied with faded lavender ribbon. Julian's breath caught. His fingers trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside were more letters, dozens of them, and a journal bound in sun-bleached leather. Atop the stack rested a watercolor painting, aged and delicate. It depicted Elise in a yellow dress standing beneath the very tree, arms open wide, as if ready to embrace the world. Julian didn't read the journal there, not yet. He simply held it to his chest and looked out over the orchard, whispering a quiet merci to Henri and Elise, two people he had never known, yet somehow now felt impossibly close to. Back inside, Isabel was making coffee and slicing warm bread. The aroma filled the kitchen with a promise of comfort. When Julian entered with the box, her eyes lit with curiosity. He placed it on the table between them, lifted the lid, and together they began to explore. Letter by letter, entry by entry, a portrait of a love story unfolded, not one of grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but one built slowly, like ivy up a stone wall. Henri had written not just of Elise, but of the rhythms of the land, the joys of baking simple tarts, the hush of winter mornings, the way the ducks waddled toward him when he whistled. His world was not grand, but it was full. Every detail was a kind of love poem. One passage read, "There is no such thing as a quiet day here. Even in the silence, the garden speaks, the wind hums, The fireplace tells its stories and crackles. And if I listen hard enough, I can still hear Elise singing as she moves through the halls. Her song never ends. It simply waits for the right ears. By the end of the morning, Julian and Isabel were no longer just guests. They were stewards of a memory, of a home, of something that had lived and breathed through decades. The next day, Julian began to restore the old garden bench beneath the pear tree. Isabel painted the kitchen shutters a soft periwinkle. Neither action was planned. They simply arose from a desire to care for what had been left in their hands. And each night, before bed, they would read another letter, and fall asleep a little deeper, with hearts a little fuller. The chateau, too, seemed to rest easier. And beneath the pear tree, the roots sighed with contentment, knowing that the past had been heard, and the present, at long last, was listening. The week passed slowly, but not unpleasantly, like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. In the village of Saint-Remy-du-Lac, the air grew cooler each day, and golden leaves rustled in soft conversation along the cobbled paths. People wore scarves now, tucked their hands into pockets, and greeted one another with smiles and nods, as though each shared in a small, unspoken secret of seasonal peace. One morning, as Isabel poured coffee into mismatched porcelain cups, a knock came at the heavy wooden door of the chateau. It was Lucien, the elderly baker from town, with flour on his sleeves and laughter in his eyes. "Did you forget?" he asked, as if Julian and Isabel should know already. "Today's the Fête de la Moisson, the harvest fair." Julian looked at him blankly. "It happens every year." Lucien chuckled. "Since long before any of us were born. Music, wine, roasted chestnuts, dancing, and the goats wear little hats." "The goats wear hats?" Isabel asked, setting her cup down. "Hats with feathers." Lucien nodded solemnly. And so, after breakfast and a quick change into warmer clothes, Julian and Isabel found themselves walking down the road to the village square. The path was lined with tall trees just beginning to turn amber. Occasionally, a bicycle would pass them, its rider waving cheerfully as a basket of apples bumped along the back. When they arrived at the square, it was as though the entire village had unfolded itself into celebration. Stalls brimmed with jars of honey, bundles of lavender, bottles of wine wrapped in ribbon. Children chased each other around hay bales, and musicians played a soft reel on violins and accordions beneath strings of glowing lanterns. The scent of cinnamon, baked apples, and wood smoke filled the air. It wasn't a grand fair, nothing like the bustling cities of France might offer. But it was perfect, like a painting one could step into and never wish to leave. Julian and Isabel wandered slowly. At one stall, they bought wool mittens from a woman who spun her own yarn. At another, they sampled fresh pear tarts, the kind that crumbled gently in the mouth. Isabel tried a cup of vin chaude, gently spiced and warm in her hands. Julian bought a wooden carving of a fox from a stooped old man who claimed it brought luck. Near the town well, a group of children put on a little puppet show. There was no stage, just a blanket and a wooden box, but their voices rang with such glee that passers-by stopped to watch, chuckling softly and clapping when it ended. Then, just after midday, The musicians struck up a waltz. Couples turned beneath the lanterns, scarves flying, cheeks pink with the brisk air. Lucian grabbed the hand of his wife, who wore a sunflower pinned to her coat, and spun her laughing into the dance. Julian hesitated, but Isabel nudged him gently. "Come on," she smiled. "It's not every day you get to waltz with goats in hats." So they danced, slow at first, a bit clumsy, laughing at their missteps. But soon, the music carried them along, as though their feet remembered something their minds had forgotten. Around them, the world blurred into a soft watercolor of movement and joy. And in the corner of the square, sitting peacefully in the shade, were indeed a handful of goats. They wore tiny straw hats decorated with autumn leaves and feathers. One goat, a particularly sleepy fellow, blinked slowly and chewed on a piece of grass, completely unbothered by the attention. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the cobblestones, Isabel and Julian sat at a wooden table by the fountain. An old woman named Odette brought them slices of roasted pumpkin with goat cheese and thyme. She poured them each a final glass of cider and told them, with twinkling eyes, "This place remembers you, even if you've never been here before." Julian wasn't sure what she meant, but it stayed with him, tucked into the corners of his heart like a note pressed into a book. As dusk settled, lanterns flickered like stars overhead. The fair did not end with fireworks or announcements. It simply faded into quiet conversation, into goodbyes and gentle laughter, and the sound of wind moving through the trees. Julian and Isabel walked home in the silver-blue glow of moonlight, their hands tucked into one another's pockets. The chateau waited for them with a soft hum, a fire in the hearth, the scent of tea, the kind of silence that welcomes you like an old friend. That night, as the wind rustled gently through the vines climbing the window frames, Julian dreamed of Elise in her yellow dress and Henri riding beneath the pear tree. Not as ghosts, but as warm presences, part of the land, the house, the story that was still being written. And somewhere out in the orchard, a goat snored softly beneath the stars. The morning after the fair arrived gently, as if the village itself were still stretching from a deep, contented sleep. A pale light touched the frost-laced windows of the chateau, and the only sound was the soft whistle of the kettle on the stove. Julian was the first to rise, wrapping himself in a woolen cardigan and tiptoeing into the kitchen, where he brewed a pot of coffee and sliced a loaf of bread left from the fair. The crust was still crunchy, and the center warm and fragrant. He buttered 2 slices and placed them on mismatched plates beside tiny glasses of peach preserves. Isabel joined him shortly after, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair tied loosely with a ribbon. "Did you dream anything strange?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Julian nodded. "About Elise again." She was laughing. It felt peaceful. They ate in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. The kind that settles between people like a warm quilt. Later that morning, as clouds drifted lazily across the sky, Julian decided to climb to the attic, a place he had avoided during his first few days. Something about it had felt too private, too untouched. But now, curiosity tugged gently at him. He found the attic door behind a narrow hallway bookshelf. hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. The wooden stairs creaked as he climbed, and dust danced like golden snowflakes in the beam of light streaming through the small round window at the top. The attic was full of old trunks, hat boxes, broken chairs, and books with spines faded to whisper thin lines. Cobwebs connected corners like delicate lace. But it was one trunk, in particular, that caught his eye, a small, dark chest with iron hinges and a leather handle worn smooth with age. On the lid was a brass plaque etched with the initials, H.L. Henri Laurent. Julian crouched beside it, heart ticking slowly, and opened the lid. Inside, neatly tied with faded blue ribbons, were letters, dozens of them, all addressed in the same looping hand. To Elise. Some were worn thin, as if they had been read and reread many times. Others were still crisp, sealed with wax or tied with twine. There were also sketches, charcoal drawings of trees, of the chateau, of a woman dancing under a pear tree, her dress billowing like a sail in the wind. Julian sat there for a long time, carefully opening one letter after another. The words were gentle, poetic, sometimes wistful, sometimes joyous. Henri had written of his days tending the garden, of the strange behavior of the crows, of dreams he had where he and Elise lived forever in a house full of music and wine and sun-dappled floors. Some letters described evenings by the hearth. Others spoke of loneliness during Elise's travels to Paris or Marseille. And there were love poems, some playful, some aching. One letter ended simply, "You are the reason the walls of this house still stand." Julian's throat tightened. He read until the light shifted, until the air in the attic turned a little cooler, and the dust stopped dancing. Gently, he bundled the letters and sketches back into the trunk, but took one envelope with him, a sealed one marked only with the date of Elise's passing. Later that afternoon, Julian showed Isabel the attic and the chest. Together, they made tea and sat on the wide steps leading out into the garden. There, with the gentle rustle of dry leaves around them, they opened the final letter. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a beginning. Henri had written, "If you're reading this, my Elise, then we've outlived time itself. Perhaps these words find you in the wind through the trees, or in the dreams of those who come after us. If so, let them know love never leaves the walls it has warmed." Julian folded the letter and looked up at the bare branches of the pear tree. "I think," Isabel said softly, "this house is still full of love." That evening, they lit a fire in the hearth and placed the letter on the mantel. Not as decoration, but as something sacred. Something that would remain. Outside, stars began to blink into view, one by one. And as they sat in silence, wrapped in blankets, a soft sound came from the kitchen, the creak of the old floorboard, the gentle rattle of teacups. They didn't startle. They simply smiled. Because some places remember. The wind was soft that morning, barely brushing against the shutters of the chateau like a breath from the past. Julian awoke slowly, still lulled by the memory of Henry's words. It was as if the letter they had read had settled not just into the walls of the old house but into their dreams too. Downstairs, the scent of orange peel and cinnamon drifted from the stove. Isabel had prepared a warm pot of mulled tea. She was seated by the window, wrapped in a shawl, a small journal open on her knees. Julian joined her quietly. "I couldn't sleep much," she said, not looking up. "I kept hearing something, not voices, but music." Julian blinked. "Music?" Isabel nodded slowly. "Like a violin. Far away. Like it was practicing something forgotten." They sat for a long moment in stillness. And then, drawn by a strange hush, not silence exactly, but a kind of listening, they rose and wandered toward the eastern wing of the chateau. The hall there was less restored than the others. Dust still clung to the wainscoting. The rugs were threadbare. The doors had been untouched for decades. One door in particular, at the very end of the corridor, stood slightly ajar. It was a small room, lit by tall windows that reached up into the beams. The furniture inside was minimal: a faded chaise longue, a writing desk, a narrow bookshelf filled with aged scores and sheet music, and in the center of the room, a violin case resting gently on a velvet stool. Julian approached the case slowly, almost reverently. He undid the clasps. Inside, the violin gleamed faintly, though the strings were loose and the bow dry. Still, it had not cracked. It had waited. "I think this was hers," Julian said. "Elise." He picked up a sheet of music. Handwritten. The title read, "Chanson pour une maison endormie," a song for a sleeping house. Isabel touched the music gently. "Maybe this is what you heard." They decided that evening to try playing it. Julian had taken violin lessons as a child, though he had not touched an instrument in years. But his fingers remembered more than he expected. He restrung the violin, carefully tuned it, and rosined the old bow with hands both clumsy and tender. When night fell and the house grew quiet, they lit only a single oil lamp in the music room. Shadows flickered across the walls like dancers. And Julian began to play. The melody was simple, slow, melancholic, filled with long, sighing phrases that rose and fell like breath. Each note seemed to pull something from the room, like old dust shaken from a curtain, or memories stirred from the air itself. And then, something strange. The sound of a second violin. At first they thought it was an echo, or a trick of the acoustics. But it wasn't. It was too deliberate. It followed Julian's melody with harmonies, soft, aching harmonies that came from nowhere. Isabel froze. Julian didn't stop. He closed his eyes and let the music lead him. The second violin moved with his own as though it had been waiting for him, not to perform, but to listen. When the piece ended, the second violin faded like mist at dawn. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The next day, they explored the music room more thoroughly. In a hidden drawer in the desk, they found a second score, a duet. This one, dated just weeks before Elise's passing. Its title, Pour sucre restaurant, for those who remain. The discovery seemed to unlock something in the house. A new gentleness. The floors no longer creaked with reluctance but with familiarity. The fire in the hearth burned longer. The garden, though winter-worn, seemed to blush with life. Over the next days, Julian played often, sometimes alone, sometimes with the second violin that never showed itself but always answered. And Isabel began writing. Not just notes, or letters, or poems, but a book. A story about a house that remembered, a garden that listened, and music that waited to be heard again. In the evenings, they sat by the pear tree with wine and candles, even when the wind was brisk. And when they played the final bars of the duet, a single pear would fall from the branches above, even though the tree had long since stopped bearing fruit. Julian once whispered, "Do you think we're living inside someone else's story?" Isabel smiled. "Maybe. But now we're writing our own chapter." The house agreed, in its own quiet way. The sun slipped behind the hills. The wind carried the sound of two violins, intertwined like vines over an old wall. And the stars, those ancient keepers of silence, blinked once more into a sky that never forgot. To be continued. The next morning in St. Clement rose like a painting in soft pastel. A lavender mist still lingered low along the hills, wrapping the sleepy valley in a gentle hush. Colette awoke to the distant cooing of wood pigeons, their rhythmic calls echoing between the vineyards. A warm shaft of morning sun filtered through the linen curtains, casting golden patterns on the terracotta floor. She sat up slowly, her hair tousled from dreams she couldn't quite remember. Wrapping herself in a shawl, she stepped out onto the small balcony. The air smelled of warm stone, thyme, and the last cool notes of the night. Below, the baker's boy was delivering bread, his bicycle squeaking along the cobblestone lane. Across the courtyard, Jacques was already tending to the herb garden, gently pinching back sprigs of rosemary, humming an old folk song under his breath. When he looked up and saw her, he smiled with that easy, unhurried warmth that Provence seemed to bestow on all its inhabitants. "Coffee is almost ready," he called softly. Later, they sat in the courtyard beneath the fig tree, sipping coffee from ceramic cups that had belonged to Jacques' grandmother. Colette traced the painted patterns on hers absent-mindedly as they spoke about nothing and everything, about the olive harvest, about a missing cat in the next village, about the curious habit of clouds over Montaigne's Saint Victoire. After breakfast, they strolled along a winding dirt path that led away from the village. The fields were dotted with sleepy sheep, and the cicadas had just begun their daily chorus. Every turn in the path revealed another postcard-perfect view. A crumbling stone wall blanketed in ivy, a field of poppies swaying in the breeze, the distant shimmer of the Rhone. They stopped at a weathered bench beneath an ancient almond tree, where Jacques pulled out his small sketchbook. He began to draw, his hand moving lazily, sketching the curved lines of the landscape and the stillness of the moment. Colette rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, lulled by the soft sound of pencil on paper and the hum of life all around them. They spent the afternoon in quiet rhythm, picking peaches from the orchard, feeding leftover bread to the ducks in the stream, reading in the shade. A warm breeze stirred the leaves and carried with it the faint strains of accordion music from a distant farmhouse. When the sun began its descent, turning the sky a glowing amber, they returned to the cottage to prepare dinner. The meal was simple and lovely: a crusty loaf, a wedge of goat cheese, sun-warmed tomatoes, and a bottle of the lightest rose. They ate outside under a sky slowly filling with stars, After dinner, they lit a lantern and sat in silence for a while. Fireflies blinked lazily in the garden, and a gentle wind rustled the vine leaves along the fence. Colette leaned back in her chair, the scent of lavender and wine settling around her like a blanket. Later, as they climbed into bed, the soft creak of the old wood floors beneath them, she whispered, "This place, it feels like it has always been waiting for us." Jacques squeezed her hand gently. "And we were always meant to find it." The night folded around them, quiet and full of peace, as the stars watched over St. Clement like a lullaby written in light. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of the old chateau, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. Julien stirred awake, the scent of blooming jasmine wafting in through the open window. He stretched leisurely, the memories of the previous night's music still lingering in his mind. Downstairs, Isabelle was already in the kitchen, humming a soft tune as she prepared breakfast. The aroma of freshly baked croissants and brewed coffee filled the air, creating a comforting ambience. Julien joined her, and they shared a quiet meal. The kind that spoke of deep companionship and understanding. After breakfast, they decided to explore the neglected part of the garden, a section overgrown with wildflowers and ivy. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon a hidden alcove, where a weathered stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree. The area exuded a serene charm, as if it had been waiting for their discovery. On the bench lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Curious, Julien opened it to find sketches of the chateau, the garden, and portraits of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Elise. The journal belonged to Henri, detailing his thoughts, dreams, and his profound love for Elise. Reading through the entries, Julien and Isabelle felt a deep connection to the past, as if the garden had shared its secret with them. They spent the afternoon restoring the alcove, trimming the overgrowth and planting new flowers, breathing life back into the forgotten sanctuary. As evening approached, they sat on the restored bench, watching the sun set over the horizon. The sky painted hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the garden. Julien took out his violin, playing a melody inspired by Henry's journal, a tune that seemed to harmonize with the whispers of the wind and the rustling leaves. The music flowed effortlessly, weaving the past and present into a tapestry of sound. Isabelle closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, feeling a profound sense of peace and belonging. That night, as they retired to their rooms, the chateau seemed to embrace them, its walls echoing with the harmonies of love, memories, and newfound connections. The garden's secret had been unveiled, adding another chapter to the timeless story of the chateau and its inhabitants. The following morning unfolded with the slow, golden grace of a Vermeer painting. Light filtered gently into the drawing room where Julien found Isabelle already seated, a steaming teacup in her hands, a woolen shawl draped softly over her shoulders. She sat beside a small wooden chest they had retrieved from the hidden alcove the day before. It was worn, with brass corners dulled by time and a delicate engraving of vines twining across its lid. Julien joined her without words, and together they opened the chest, the hinges creaking like a sigh from the past. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with blue silk ribbon, their corners curled, their envelopes yellowed to the soft hue of antique lace. The first letter bore Henry's fine handwriting and was addressed simply, "A mon étoile," to my star. They read in silence, the words flowing like the gentlest of lullabies. My dearest Elise, today I saw the sunlight glint in your hair like fields of wheat in late summer. If I could only bottle that light, I would keep it beside me when you are away, to remember the golden warmth of your presence. The letter was full of tender reflections, observations of everyday moments, walking beneath the apple trees, listening to the rain against the greenhouse glass, watching her paint in the garden. It was not grand declarations of love, but the quiet recognition of joy and simple companionship. Letter by letter, they pieced together the slow, rhythmic unfolding of Omri and Elise's life together. A love story not of drama, but of quiet gestures, shared glances, the brush of fingers over parchment. Outside, the air remained still, as if the world itself held its breath to listen. As the hours passed, Isabel lit a fire in the hearth. Rain had begun to fall in a soft, almost apologetic drizzle, the sound tapping gently against the window panes. Julian leaned back in the armchair, one hand curled around the half-read letter, his expression serene. Isabel stood and wandered to the old record player. With careful hands, she placed the dusty vinyl and lowered the needle. A soft piano began to play, wrapping the room in sound like a shawl around cold shoulders. "Listen," she whispered, though the house was already listening. "It's as if they never left." Julian nodded. "Their presence, it's everywhere. The house remembers." Later that afternoon, the rain cleared, and they ventured to the greenhouse mentioned so often in Henry's letters. The glass panes were still intact, if fogged with age. Inside, vines had grown wild, orchids had taken root in the soil, and ferns burst joyfully through the paving stones. They tidied a bit, just enough to uncover a small iron bistro table and 2 chairs tucked in a corner. Julian wiped the surface, and they sat together, sharing warm tea from a thermos Isabel had prepared earlier. As the steam rose between them, Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. "I've started writing again," he said quietly. "Music, but also thoughts. Feelings." Isabel smiled. "Like Henri?" "Yes. Maybe I'll leave a letter behind too, one day." They sat in silence, not needing to fill the air with anything more than the sound of wind threading through the trees outside, and the occasional bird call that pierced the quiet like a tiny, silver bell. That evening, they returned to the drawing room and carefully packed the letters back into the chest, readying the ribbon and replacing the lid. But before they did, Isabel slipped one note from the stack and placed it aside. Later, before going to bed, she slipped it under Julian's door. "To a soul who listens as deeply as he plays. You are writing your own music now, but I wonder, would you ever let someone join you in the melody?" That night, the chateau dreamed with them. It dreamed in candlelight and old ink, in ivy-covered greenhouses and the warmth of tea shared in silence. The dreams were not exciting, not loud or wild, but they were comforting, soothing as a lullaby sung by time itself. And somewhere in the soft dark, a violin hummed quietly on its own. As the golden sun ascended above the horizon of southern France, the sleepy village of Orle awakened to a new day with gentle rustling of olive leaves and the faint scent of croissants drifting from kitchens. On the veranda of Maison Mistral, nestled between a low stone wall and blooming pink oleanders, Celeste stood with a porcelain cup of lavender tea cradled between her palms. Her eyes, still softened by dreams, watched a small butterfly dancing above a sprig of thyme. Luke joined her, yawning quietly, stretching his arms above his head. His tousled hair caught a glint of sunlight. "Sleep well?" he asked, leaning gently against the wooden railing beside her. "I dreamt of gardens," Celeste replied with a smile. "Endless ones, with violet trees and white rabbits that hummed songs." Luke chuckled softly, placing his hand on hers. "Then we must have passed through the same dream. I heard music in the breeze." Breakfast was simple and perfect. Slices of golden brioche with peach jam, a bowl of fresh figs, and thick yogurt drizzled with honey. They ate slowly, savoring each flavor. No words were necessary. The peaceful rhythm of the village around them, the cooing of doves, the chime of a bicycle bell, the distant laughter of schoolchildren, was enough. Later that morning, they strolled hand in hand through the sleepy cobblestone streets, where morning dew still clung to the lavender leaves. Their path led them toward the old orchard, where wild pears fell lazily onto sun-dappled grass and bees buzzed around old stone troughs filled with clear water. Every step felt like an echo of centuries past, soft and slow. Celeste picked a wild poppy and tucked it behind Luke's ear. "Très chic," she teased. Luke grinned, lifting a cluster of grapes from a vine and offering her one. Sunshine turned into fruit. They found themselves drawn toward the path known to the villagers as La Promenade des Cours. It was said that lovers who walked it slowly and in silence would never part ways. The path wove gently between two low hills, lined with cypress trees and old stone benches shaded by trellises of wisteria. The air was thick with the perfume of roses and aged vines. Halfway along the promenade, a small wooden sign appeared, hand-painted and faded. "Sit. Speak no words. Let the heart listen." Luke and Celeste sat together on the moss-covered bench. For a long while, there was only stillness. Then the rustle of wisteria in the wind. Then the call of a hoopoe bird. Then, softly, the brush of Luke's fingertips along her wrist. It was in this stillness that Celeste felt something deepen, not a revelation or sudden surge, but a gentle grounding, like roots quietly growing deeper into soil. Her heart felt steady, known. In the distance, the church bell rang once, not for time, but tradition. Noon. They continued on their way, descending the gentle slope toward a pond where a wooden dock stretched into the calm water. They removed their sandals and dipped their feet into the cool ripples, watching the koi beneath flicker like colored flames. Luke lay back on the dock, arms behind his head. "Do you think we'll always be this happy?" he asked. Celeste tilted her head toward the clouds, her voice soft. "Happiness is not a moment. It's the space we build around us. This," she gestured to the hills, the trees, the dock. "This is our architecture. As the sky deepened to a golden apricot hue, they slowly made their way back toward the village. Children chased dragonflies near the fountains, and an elderly man played accordion beneath the vines of the corner cafe. That evening, the Maison Mistral glowed with lamplight. They shared a dinner of creamy polenta with mushrooms, grilled peaches, and lavender creme brulee. Afterward, Luke read aloud by the hearth from a volume of Rilke, while Celeste dozed with her head against his shoulder. Outside, the wind carried the soft hum of cicadas and the scent of night jasmine. And as the stars emerged one by one, quiet, ancient, shimmering, the lavender wind passed once more through the grove and into the hearts of those who chose to listen. As twilight descended upon the quaint village of St. Clement, a soft, golden hue bathed the cobblestone streets, and the air was imbued with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and freshly baked pastries. The villagers bustled with anticipation, for tonight marked the annual Fête de Lanterns, a cherished tradition celebrating hope, remembrance, and the gentle passage of time. Colette and Jacques prepared for the evening with quiet excitement. Colette donned a flowing lavender dress, its fabric whispering against her skin like the petals of a flower, while Jacques wore a crisp white shirt with suspenders, a nod to the timeless elegance of the region. Together, they carried their handcrafted lanterns, delicate creations of paper and wire, each adorned with personal symbols and messages. As night fell, the village square transformed into a sea of flickering lights. Lanterns of all shapes and sizes danced in the gentle breeze, their warm glow reflecting in the eyes of the gathered crowd. Children giggled as they chased the shadows, and elders shared stories of festivals past, their voices weaving a tapestry of memories. A hush fell over the crowd as the village mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage, his voice resonating with warmth and reverence. He spoke of the festival's origins, of honoring those who came before and embracing the light within each of us. With a gentle nod, he signaled the commencement of the lantern release. One by one, villagers released their lanterns into the night sky. The lanterns ascended gracefully, their soft illumination mingling with the stars, creating a celestial dance of light and shadow. Colette and Jacques stood hand in hand, their eyes reflecting the myriad of lights above. As their lantern drifted upward, Colette whispered a wish into the night, her voice barely audible over the collective murmurs of hope and remembrance. Jacques squeezed her hand gently, his silent affirmation resonating with shared dreams and unspoken promises. The festival continued with music and dance, the melodies of accordions and violins filling the air, inviting all to partake in the joyous celebration. Laughter and song echoed through the village, a harmonious blend of past and present, of tradition and renewal. As the night wore on, the crowd gradually dispersed, leaving behind a lingering sense of unity and peace. Colette and Jacques strolled back to their cottage, the path illuminated by the soft glow of remaining lanterns and the gentle light of the moon. They walked in comfortable silence, their hearts full, their spirits uplifted by the evening's enchantment. Back home, they settled into their cozy living room, the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. They sipped herbal tea, the warmth seeping into their souls, as they reflected on the night's events. The festival had not only honored the past, but had also kindled a renewed sense of hope and connection within them. As they prepared for bed, the soft rustle of leaves outside their window served as a lullaby, a gentle reminder of the ever-present whispers of the lavender wind. They drifted into sleep, their dreams filled with light, love, and the enduring magic of Saint Clement. As dawn broke over the rolling hills of Provence, the gentle light painted the landscape in hues of gold and lavender. The scent of blooming fields wafted through the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-kissed soil. In the quaint village of Saint Clement, life stirred slowly, embracing the tranquility of the morning. Colette and Jacques awoke to the soft chirping of birds outside their window. The previous night's festival of lanterns had left a lingering sense of serenity in their hearts. They shared a quiet breakfast of freshly baked bread, creamy butter, and sweet fig jam, savoring each bite as the sun's rays warmed their cozy kitchen. After breakfast, they decided to visit the nearby lavender fields, a place where they often found solace and inspiration. The path to the fields meandered through ancient olive groves and wildflower meadows, each step accompanied by the soothing sounds of nature. Upon reaching the fields, they were greeted by rows upon rows of vibrant lavender, their purple blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. The air was thick with the plant's calming fragrance, enveloping them in a cocoon of peace. They walked hand in hand, their fingers brushing against the soft petals, absorbing the energy of the land. As they wandered, they came across a secluded spot beneath a towering cypress tree. There they sat on a weathered wooden bench, listening to the whispers of the earth carried by the wind. The rustling leaves and distant hum of bees created a symphony of natural sounds that lulled them into a meditative state. Colette closed her eyes, allowing the sensations to wash over her. She felt a deep connection to the land, as if the very soil beneath her feet held the memories of generations past. Jacques, sensing her introspection, gently squeezed her hand, grounding her in the present. They spent the afternoon in quiet reflection, occasionally sharing thoughts and dreams inspired by the landscape. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the fields, they made their way back to the village, hearts full and minds at ease. That evening, they sat on their veranda, sipping herbal tea as the stars emerged one by one in the night sky. The gentle rustle of the lavender fields in the distance served as a lullaby, guiding them into a restful slumber filled with dreams of nature's embrace. The village of Saint Clement slept under the tender gaze of the moon. Its soft, silvery light bathed the rooftops and lavender fields, casting a gentle glow over the cobbled lanes and shuttered windows. All was still. All was calm. In their little stone cottage on the hill, Colette stirred from a peaceful sleep. Something in the night had called to her, not a sound, but a feeling. She slipped quietly from the warm embrace of her linen sheets, careful not to wake Jacques, whose slow, steady breathing was as rhythmic as a lullaby. She wrapped herself in a knitted shawl and padded barefoot across the creaking floorboards. The old house welcomed her steps with familiarity. At the window, she paused, gazing out over the countryside, where moonlight pooled like milk in the valleys between the hills. A soft breeze pushed open the shutters, carrying with it the subtle perfume of lavender and the cool hush of midnight. Colette closed her eyes. She listened, not for noise, but for presence, the kind of stillness that spoke without words. And there it was again, that curious pull, as if the night itself was inviting her to step outside. She slipped on her sandals, took the small lantern from the hook by the door, and lit it with a match. The warm glow flickered gently as she stepped out into the hush of the world. The village lay in repose, every home tucked in, every dog curled into itself, every leaf unmoving. Colette made her way slowly down the garden path, her light dancing on the stones. She didn't know why, but her feet led her toward the ancient fig tree near the communal well. It was a gathering place in daylight, full of voices and laughter. But by night, it stood like a sentinel of time, tall, gnarled, and wise. As she arrived, she found something surprising. Jacques, already there, sitting on the stone rim of the well with a woolen blanket over his shoulders and a clay cup in his hand. He smiled without surprise. "I hoped you'd come." She smiled back, her eyes soft. "You felt it too?" He nodded. "The night, it's thick with memory." Colette sat beside him, and they passed the cup back and forth, sipping warm mulled wine that Jacques had quietly prepared while she slept. The flavors of clove, orange, and cinnamon lingered on the tongue, grounding them in the comfort of now. Above them, the stars shimmered brighter than usual. They sat in silence for a while, letting the moonlight do the speaking. The air felt timeless, like they were no longer two people in a village but part of something ancient and ongoing. Jacques eventually broke the silence. "Do you ever think the moon remembers things we forget?" Colette considered. "I think it remembers what matters." As the night deepened, they shared stories of their youth. Little things, like the first market they visited together, or the first time they danced beneath the village square's fairy lights. They spoke of their grandparents, long gone, and of the hopes they still held for the years ahead. But their words were slow, dreamlike, spaced out like the notes of a lullaby. From the fig tree, a sleepy owl blinked once, turned its head, and glided away into the quiet. A cat stretched and curled on a nearby wall. Somewhere in the fields, a nightingale let out a single, tremulous note before falling silent again. Eventually, Colette leaned her head on Jacques' shoulder. "I love that this place grows quieter the longer we stay," she murmured. "It lets us hear ourselves," Jacques replied. They stayed that way for a long time, warmed by the wine and the wool blanket and the closeness of each other. The moon arced higher, casting their shadows onto the well stones like figures in an old painting. When they finally returned to the house, dawn was beginning to stir, just barely. The first blush of morning hinted on the horizon. Colette and Jacques climbed into bed again, pulling the covers up, their bodies warmed by the memory of night and the whispers of the lavender wind. The window was still ajar. From outside, the faint rustle of a fig leaf and the distant hush of the fields kept their breath company. And as they drifted back to sleep, the moon dipped lower, satisfied. It had watched over them once again. Dawn tiptoed into the valley, golden and slow, brushing the rooftops of St. Clement with a touch of pale light. The village didn't wake all at once. It stretched gently, like a cat in the warmth of morning. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Roosters crowed with no real urgency. And from the stone bakery at the corner of Rue du Pommier, the soft scent of fresh bread rose like a hymn. At the heart of this scent was Marguerite. Marguerite was a baker by trade and soul. She had worked the ovens for nearly 50 years, and though her hands had grown more knotted with age, they still held the delicate rhythm of kneading dough like a lullaby. Her mornings began before the stars had finished blinking, long before the rest of the village stirred. Today, though, was special. Today, Marguerite would bake the solstice loaves, an old tradition almost forgotten, passed to her by her grandmother, who spoke of how bread could carry blessings. The loaves were made only once a year, on the longest day of sunlight, and their recipe had been memorized, not written. She moved through her kitchen like a priestess of comfort. Flour fell like snowfall onto the wooden table. The warm bowl of water, touched with honey and wild yeast, steamed softly. She added crushed lavender and a hint of lemon zest, never too much, just enough to catch the nose when the crust cracked. As the dough rested beneath a cotton cloth, Marguerite stepped outside for a moment, her apron dusted in white. The sky was beginning to bloom with morning colors, roses and creams and the faintest hints of gold. The fig tree near the well stood still, as if listening. "Today I'll need your help," she whispered to the air, as if speaking to her ancestors. "Let them rise with joy." In another part of the village, Colette and Jacques stirred once again. After their moonlit walk and return to bed, they'd only half slept, cradled by that in-between space where dreams and reality curled into each other. Jacques made coffee, while Colette tied her hair with a ribbon. They spoke little, only what was needed, the kind of silence that needed no apology. "I'll go early to Marguerite," said Colette, slipping on her shoes. "She might need help lifting the dough." Jacques nodded and handed her a folded napkin. Inside, a small bundle of lavender tied with string. For her table, Colette walked slowly down the sun-warmed path. The light had not yet grown harsh. It was a warm blush, like sunlight filtered through lace. Birds chirped softly from the hedgerows, and bees had only just begun their lazy patrols of the flowers. When she arrived, Marguerite was already shaping the loaves. Her hands moved with steady grace. Colette entered without knocking. They'd known each other too long for formalities, and the two exchanged smiles, wordless but full of meaning. Together, they shaped the dough into braided rings, scoring each with symbols from long ago: the sun, a sprig of lavender, a spiral of growth. By midday, the loaves had cooled on linen cloths, their golden crust cracking gently. One by one, villagers stopped by, drawn not just by the smell, but by something subtler, something woven into the dough itself. A feeling of home, of continuity, of quiet celebration. Each person received a loaf, warm to the touch, and each walked away slower than they arrived, as if the bread asked them to savor not just the flavor, but the moment. Colette and Jacques sat later on their garden bench, a half-eaten loaf between them, slices soft and fragrant. "It's like tasting the sun," Jacques said. "And time," Colette added. They watched as Marguerite closed her shutters for the afternoon, dusted her apron, and looked out at the valley one more time before retreating into the cool of her home. She had done enough. The village would carry her offering into the evening. That night, as the sky turned indigo and fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns in the hedgerows, the people of St. Clement slept deeply. The wind carried the scent of lavender and sun-warmed stone. The fig tree by the well stood watchful and kind. And far above, the stars took their slow positions, whispering old blessings in a language made not of words, but of warmth and memory. The village of St. Clement awoke to a morning bathed in golden light, the sun casting a warm glow over the cobblestone streets and stone cottages. The scent of blooming lavender wafted through the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread from Marguerite's bakery. Colette stood by the window of her cottage, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hands. She watched as the villagers began their day, children chasing each other with laughter, artisans setting up their stalls, and neighbors exchanging warm greetings. The tranquility of the morning filled her with a sense of peace and contentment. Jacques joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "It's a beautiful day," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. She smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Perfect for tending to the garden," she replied. Their garden, nestled behind the cottage, was a haven of colors and fragrances. Rows of lavender swayed gently in the breeze, interspersed with blooming roses, daisies, and herbs. A stone path meandered through the greenery, leading to a wooden bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. As they stepped into the garden, Colette noticed a small, weathered box tucked beneath the bench. Curious, she retrieved it and opened the lid, revealing an assortment of seeds, each labeled in delicate handwriting. "Forgotten seeds," she read aloud. Jacques peered over her shoulder. "These must have belonged to the previous owner," he mused. "Perhaps we should plant them and see what memories they hold." Facebook, eBay. With care, they prepared a section of the garden, sowing the seeds into the rich soil. As they worked, they shared stories and dreams, laughter mingling with the songs of birds overhead. The act of planting felt symbolic, a nurturing of the past, a hope for the future. Days turned into weeks, and the garden flourished. The forgotten seeds sprouted into vibrant blooms, each unique and captivating. The garden became a sanctuary, not just for Colette and Jacques, but for the entire village. Neighbors would visit, drawn by the beauty and serenity, finding solace among the petals and leaves. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the garden, Colette and Jacques sat on the bench beneath the oak tree. They watched fireflies dance among the flowers, their glow adding a touch of magic to the twilight. "This garden," Colette whispered, "it's more than just plants and flowers. It's a tapestry of memories, of love and life." Jacques nodded, his gaze tender. "And it's ours to cherish and share." As night enveloped St. Clement, the garden stood as a testament to the enduring power of nature, memory, and love, a place where whispers of the lavender wind carried stories of the past into the hearts of those who listened. Spring had unfurled its tender fingers across the valley, coaxing St. Clement into a gentle awakening. The lavender fields, still shy from winter's embrace, began to blush with the first hints of purple. The air was imbued with the sweet promise of blossoms yet to come, and the village stirred with anticipation. Colette stood at the edge of her garden, her eyes tracing the delicate buds that peeked through the soil. Each sprout was a testament to patience and care, a silent herald of the season's renewal. Jacques joined her, carrying a basket filled with freshly baked madeleines, their lemony scent mingling with the morning air. "The earth remembers," Colette mused, accepting a madeleine. Jacques nodded, his gaze sweeping over the budding landscape. "And it forgives." Lavender Wind. +4. Reddit. +4. Zillow. +4. The village buzzed with preparations for the festival of the first bloom, an age-old tradition celebrating the arrival of spring. Bunting in shades of lavender and cream adorned the streets, and the scent of blooming wisteria wafted from every corner. Children practiced dances in the square, their laughter echoing like birdsong. On the morning of the festival, Colette and Jacques joined the villagers in the square, where a long table was set with an array of delicacies, honey-glazed tarts, crusty baguettes, and bowls of ripe cherries. Musicians tuned their instruments, and the air was thick with anticipation. As the sun reached its zenith, the mayor stepped forward, a wreath of fresh blooms crowning her head. "Let us honor the earth's generosity," she proclaimed, raising a glass of elderflower wine. "And may our hearts bloom alongside the fields." The crowd erupted in cheers, and the festival commenced. Dancers twirled in the square, their movements mirroring the swaying of the lavender stalks. Music filled the air, a melody of flutes and fiddles that wove through the village like a gentle breeze. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Colette and Jacques found themselves beneath the ancient fig tree, its branches heavy with new leaves. They swayed to the music, their steps in harmony with the rhythm of the night. "In every bloom, a memory," Colette whispered. "And in every memory a seed," Jacques replied. The festival continued into the night, a celebration of life, renewal, and the enduring beauty of nature's cycles. As the stars shimmered overhead, Saint Clement basked in the gentle embrace of the lavender wind, its whispers carrying the promise of seasons to come. The morning after the festival of the first bloom, Saint Clement stirred with a soft, contented sigh. The village square was quiet once more, strewn with petals and paper lanterns left like echoes of the night's revelry. The air was cool, damp with dew, and touched by the scent of crushed lavender and fresh bread rising somewhere unseen. Colette woke early, as she often did after celebrations. Her body, though slow with age, moved with ease born from a life of repetition, ritual, and rhythm. She stood by the window in her robe, cradling a warm cup of chicory coffee in both hands, and watched as the first light spilled gently over the vineyards beyond the village. Rows of vines shimmered like lines in a book, waiting to be read again. Jacques was still sleeping, snoring softly under the quilt embroidered with little grape leaves that her grandmother had once made. Colette smiled at the familiarity of it all, the way the village breathed as one living thing, the way silence had its own music. As the sun crept over the hills, she tied on her apron and set out through the garden gate. Today was a day of quiet work, not of festivals, not of crowds, but of earth and hands and patience. The vineyard on the eastern slope, just above the chapel ruins, needed tending. The path was lined with rosemary and thyme, and her shoes brushed the soft herbs as she walked. She brought her wicker basket, empty now, but soon to be filled with early bunches of muscat grapes, not for wine yet, but for eating, sweet and gold like drops of sunlight. At the edge of the vineyard she paused. The vines stretched like arms toward the sky, leaves whispering in the breeze. She knelt and touched the soil, her fingers sinking into its softness. It was rich and cool, perfect. Soon she heard footsteps on the gravel. Jacques had woken and joined her, carrying a thermos of tea and 2 slices of walnut cake in wax paper. "Couldn't let you steal all the peace for yourself," he joked, handing her the cake. They sat on the stone wall overlooking the vineyard, the morning unfolding slowly before them. No need to speak much. The birds did the singing, and the vines the listening. Colette took a bite of cake and then leaned her head gently on Jacques' shoulder. "Do you think the vines remember?" she asked softly. He considered this. "I think the land remembers everything, and forgets nothing. Like us. The older we get, the more we remember, and the less we say." She nodded. "I feel like the vineyard grows not just grapes but moments. Old picnics. Rainstorms. That time we danced in the mud because the harvest came early." Jacques chuckled. "That was the year Etienne tried to make his own wine and it turned into vinegar. He was furious. We were all too polite to tell him." They both laughed, the sound low and steady like wind through olive trees. They began their slow, gentle work, pruning back the tender leaves, coaxing the vines upward, checking for disease. Nothing rushed. The sun warmed their backs, and bees drifted lazily through the air. A tortoise passed quietly through the vines, unbothered by the world. As noon approached, they shared their tea under a small fig tree. The sound of the distant bell tower and St. Clement rang 12 soft chimes. Either of them moved. "I think," said Colette, "this is my favorite kind of day." "Because nothing happens?" Jacques asked with a smirk. "No," she said thoughtfully. "Because everything happens. And all of it is gentle." They returned home in the late afternoon, baskets full, fingers sticky from grapes, hearts unhurried. That evening, they sat on their porch and watched the color drain from the sky as swallows traced looping shapes overhead. The quiet had returned to St. Clement, wrapping the village once more in lavender, warmth, and memory. And far off, where the horizon met the hills, the vineyard slept, content, sun-kissed, and humming softly in its dreams. In the dim hush of a St. Clement evening, when the sky bruised gently into violet and the rooftops turned dusky pink, Colette found herself in the attic again. The small wooden steps creaked with each familiar tread, and the air smelled of old cedar, dried herbs, and paper long at rest. She didn't come here often, only on rare evenings, when the wind stirred her mind toward memory. She lit a small candle in the window. The attic had no electricity, only moonlight, breeze, and time. In the far corner, beneath an old quilt and some forgotten carnival masks, sat a wooden writing desk. Its hinges squeaked slightly as she opened the roll-top cover. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, neatly tied in faded ribbons of lavender and cream. These were not love letters, not exactly. They were the letters she had written to people who had long since passed. Her mother, her sister Lisette, her schoolteacher Madame Fournier, the girl down the road who taught her to waltz, and yes, even to Etienne, the neighbor who had once confessed his affection in the rain, long before Jacques. Each letter had been written with the slow ink of quiet reflection. Never sent. Never meant to be. They were a ritual, an act of release. Tonight, she selected a bundle from the middle, the ones addressed to a future Colette. She hadn't read them in years. She sat on the small wicker chair beside the candle and began to read. Dear Colette, I hope you remember the way the fields looked when you first kissed Jacques beneath the oleander tree. I hope your back no longer aches in spring. I hope you still sing when no one's listening, even if only while making soup. She chuckled softly. She had been 27 when she wrote that one, and it was on paper that still smelled of violets. She read a few more, each one a whisper from a younger self, filled with hopes, fears, gentle wishes. Some were amusing, some a little sad, but all were honest, and all, somehow, made her feel whole. Eventually, Jacques called softly up the stairs. Mon amour, are you riding to the moon again? She smiled. Just rereading the sky. He didn't press. He never did. She tucked the letters back in place, gently as one would a baby into bed. Then, she reached for her pen and a blank sheet of thick cream paper. There was one more letter she wished to write tonight. Dear Saint Clement, thank you for being the rhythm in my bones and the stillness in my breath. Thank you for the lavender that grows even when no one watches, and for the way your cobblestones hold the sun's warmth long after dusk. She didn't finish it. Not yet. She left it open, the ink still glistening. As she stood to blow out the candle, a soft breeze passed through the attic window, lifting the edges of the paper. Below, the village lay asleep, shutters drawn, cats curled into flower pots, and the distant toll of the church bell echoing faintly through the valley. And so the attic returned to darkness, but not silence, for it now held words waiting, a letter unwritten, and a candle's last breath. In the heart of St. Clement, where the cobblestone paths meandered like forgotten lullabies and the lavender fields whispered tales to the wind, stood the ancient bell tower. Its silhouette, etched against the cerulean sky, had watched over the village for centuries, marking time with its resonant chimes. Colette often found solace in its presence, the deep tolls weaving into her daily rhythm. Yet she realized she knew little about the bell maker who had crafted its voice. Driven by curiosity, she ventured into the village archives, a room scented with aged parchment and dust. Among the brittle pages, she discovered a journal bound in worn leather. It belonged to Lucien, the bell maker of St. Clement. His entries spoke of metallurgy, of harmonics, and of a secret alloy infused with lavender oil to produce a unique timbre. He wrote of his love for a woman named Elia, whose laughter inspired the bell's melody. Moved by his words, Colette shared the journal with Jacques. Together, they decided to honor Lucien's legacy. They organized a village gathering, where stories of old were shared, and the bell's chime was celebrated anew. As twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and rose, the bell rang out, its notes carrying the essence of love, memory, and the enduring spirit of Saint Clement.